freedom with respect to homoeroticism and so forth really just we don't get it. But to the Greeks it was quite self-evident. The whole atomist theory versus the Northern European theory of atoms, they're like miniature infinities unto themselves. The infinitesimal calculus was developed by Northern Europe in contradistinction to the static plasticity of Euclidean geometry, which is simply based on form and magnitudes and not at all upon the presence of infinity within the motion of a trajectory. So that's the Greek cosmological image, and the Greeks would simply not have understood our obsession with infinity. They also had a kind of ahistorical imagination. They knew nothing about history, and they didn't care about yes, and they didn't care about what came before them. And so you always encounter the first chapter or two of a Greek history is sheer mythology, and then the person begins discussing the events in which they literally lived. Herodotus starts out by describing the Persian Wars, which occurred very close to his lifetime, and Thucydides in the history of the Peloponnesian Wars actually fought in those wars. So there's a kind of denial of infinity of time and infinity of space in the Greek imagination. For the Judeo-Christian Islamic worldview, of which we can regard them as a single unit insofar as their primary cosmological image is, as we have discussed last time, of space as a gigantic cavern. And time is conceived as a parabola within that gigantic cavern. This is the form of the mosque, which goes back to the Pantheon during the time of the Romans. That was the new world feeling that was slowly thrusting itself up through the decaying carapace of the classical Greek and Roman civilization, which at that time was dying out, and that new worldview was coming in. Just as our civilization now, the Faustian Northern European civilization, is dying out, and new mythologies and cosmologies are slowly thrusting themselves up through the heavy metal of our chromium-obsessed society. So there's no way to predict which of these cosmologies will be selected to begin the new culture cycle, but we have our seers and prophets and so forth to give us intuitions of that. The Arabic, or rather the Hindu imagination, is simply of the world as a dream. If you look at any of the great Hindu works of art, all the eyes are closed on every one of the images. The Hindus are asleep while awake, actually. They are entering into the zones that we descend into nightly while awake, and the world for them is experienced as though it were simply a massive dream. And if you look, for example, at the eyes on the sculptures of classical Athenian works of art, you find that the eyes are open, but they're just solid. There are no pupils carved into them or anything. And then in the time of when the Pantheon comes into being, and about the first century or two AD, when the new Judeo-Christian Islamic world feeling is coming in with its new admission of an inwardness, the pneuma, the spirit, the word, the logos descends down and penetrates into the soul. At exactly that time that world feeling that mythology is coming into being. If you look at the eyes on the statues, which are rendered in the Roman style, and appear to be on the surface at least copies of the old Greek and Roman statues, they have little holes bored into the pupils. Actually, they're very large holes, because there is a new inwardness, a new world feeling, a new spirit is coming into being, and it is consistent with the image of the great dome with the oculus in the center, down through which the divine radiance pours and is received by the soul, just as Mary receives the Annunciation as the angel Gabriel approaches her and tells her that she is about to become impregnated with the Word. And her response is, my soul doth magnify the Lord. And she is ready to receive impregnation through the ear as the Word enters in and becomes flesh. So these different cultures each have a sort of different cosmological vision. And they're constantly mistranslating and retranslating each other's works. And the job of each, though, is to, and so this differs from culture to culture, but the recognition of the metaphysical is the same. It is the perennial tradition. It is the one spirit that each culture is trying to render as radiant through these differing cosmological visions. So we move then to the sociological function of mythology, and like the cosmological function, this also differs from culture to culture. Each culture has a different ethos, a different ethical system, and they don't understand each other's ethics. Nietzsche built much of his life's work on the recognition of the tension, even within Northern Europe, of the differing ethical systems of what he calls master morality versus the morality of the slave. And he identified the master morality with the Greeks, particularly as exemplified in the Iliad and the Odyssey, and with the spirit in the Renaissance, and identified the slave morality with the Christians. And he says, if you contrast these two moral systems, they don't map onto each other at all. There is a distinction in the master morality between good and bad. The enemy is good. The Trojans are recognized as having the same power as the Greeks, and they are respected. They are good. They are not bad. They are not evil. He is bad who has no power. The oppressed, those who are beneath us, those who cannot repay a good deed with a good deed or avenge a murder with a murder. They are regarded as bad, beneath contempt. And that is the mythology of the master morality, which is, as it were, a kind of hawk's eye perspective that looks down, whereas the slave morality is the frog's perspective that looks up at the master. And the slave morality of the Christian worldview, according to Nietzsche, is based on the recognition of a distinction between good and evil, absolute good and absolute evil. The good person is he who does not have power to harm us, and it is worth remarking that many of the early Christians were in fact slaves living in the time of the disintegration of the Roman Empire, and they are looking up, and he is evil who has power to harm us, who has the power to oppress us. So they've completely inverted the ethical systems of the Greeks and the Romans and turned it upside down. So that's just even within the Western tradition. I mean, you look at the mythology or the ethical system of the Old Testament even and try to map it onto the New Testament, and it doesn't really map on very well. You have the sort of recognition of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth in the Old Testament. That's kind of a recognition of the master morality. If someone harms you, you harm them back, and it is only right and just that you should do so. But that's not what we find in the New Testament, where Christ says if someone slaps you, you turn the other cheek. Do not reduce yourself to their level. Simply accept it and have compassion and love and move on. So there's a different ethic there altogether. So we have these different ethical tensions, and we would not, for example, the whole Hindu practice of sati, where the wife throws herself on the husband's funeral pyre, or in some traditions is actually buried alive, we would regard as simply barbaric, and it was indeed outlawed by the British when they conquered India in the 18th century. So we have these different sociological norms that are validated by mythological traditions. And then we have finally the psychological function of mythology, which is like the metaphysical in that it is constant throughout the world. The human psyche has a certain morphology to it, a certain life course that it inevitably follows. And it is the job of myths to usher us through the various thresholds of initiation when these crisis points hit us. The first, of course, is birth, and then the second, birth of the body, but the second is the birth in adolescence of the adult. And that's a threshold that a lot of us don't make it over today in a society in which there are no mythological traditions to help guide the individual through the crisis of initiation into adulthood. And as a result, you have a lot of neurotic individuals who are still thinking of themselves in terms of what their mommy and daddy would think of them, and find themselves robbed of autonomy as a result of that. And that's crisis number one, the transition from the dependency of the child on the parents and that imago that guides the behavior and decisions of the child, versus when the threshold is crossed into adolescence, to the imago, the image that the individual should properly have of himself now as mother or father, and him or herself as one's own authority, and not always deferring to an external authority when deciding what is the proper course of action to take for oneself. The next major threshold, of course, is then the transition from full mature adulthood into old age, and the beginning of the preparation for facing death, which Jung regarded as the task, the central task of the second half of life. It is the beginnings to make an entry into the dark abyss, and mythology also should help one cross over into that, get onto that ferry boat and cross over into the other world. So those are the four, in a very brief, abbreviated fashion, those are the four basic functions of mythology. These two are constant, the metaphysical and the psychological, and these two differ from culture to culture. And the postmodernists today like to focus on the differences between cultures, and the esotericists like to focus on the similarities, what they are all saying, what they all have in common. And that's my little prelude to today's discussion. So then moving right along to the symbol without meaning. Did anybody actually make it through the essay?